So I did come to this topic from working on a book about sprawl, but I have to tell you, I didn't start out working on a book about sprawl. I started out working on a book about transportation infrastructure and how it affected cities. And I really only realized halfway, two-thirds of the way through that research project that transportation policy was the oversimplified, unexplained contributing factor to the reason why we have the land use problems that we have today. The book is based on case studies of three very different types of places. A reasonably large city, metropolitan area, Denver, a small New England town, Middlebury, Vermont, and a boom town in Tennessee. And layered over that is the way federal policy affected state policy, affected local choices. And that's going to give you a preview of where I'm going with this, is not only to emphasize the importance of understanding the policy pieces. Yesterday we did a good job, I think, of looking at some of the problems on the ground that concern us. And at the end of the day, there was a little bit of a question, which is the right question leading into today, is, so what can we do about it? What are we going to do about it? So I'm going to try to segue from the understanding the problem into the way policy relates to it, and talk about some problems with some of the current solutions and make some suggestions about general directions we can move forward. But the point that I make in the book, not only explaining how we got here, that I want to emphasize, is also the fact that this is a problem that affects American communities of all shapes, sizes, and places. It's not a Southwestern or Florida problem exclusively. It's not only a problem in the way we filled up space in New Jersey, but it's also a problem for every region, no matter where you live in the U.S. This is a national problem, and I'm going to repeat that theme here. Okay, so let's start with the premise that this pattern that we have for land use development in the U.S. that we call sprawl is a result, I'm suggesting, of the idea that Americans' choices about where they live and how they are going to live their lives have been affected by three interrelated factors: housing policy, transportation policy, and intentional, deliberate efforts to shape American culture and American value. I refuse to accept the idea that this is what Americans want, these are American values, stop trying to change America, because these are all cultural constructs. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. And so after I explain what I mean by these housing policy, transportation policy, and cultural preferences items, then I'll briefly touch on problems with some recent smart growth movements. Okay, so housing policy in brief, because much of this was touched upon yesterday. Housing policy here, in this case, I want to point out that this isn't a post-World War II phenomenon that we've had in place, a housing policy that encourages people to live in single-family homes, in newly built subdivisions, on the periphery, and make it more difficult for people to choose to live in multifamily structures and denser places in more urban locations. And this didn't start recently. Going all the way back to right after World War I, before Herbert Hoover was president, he was Secretary of Commerce, and he started, amongst other initiatives, he had 4 different initiatives in this direction, but he was really convinced that America would be a better place if everybody could own their own home. He was convinced of that for anti-communist reasons. He would say, show me a man who owns his own home, and I'll show you a man who will never be a communist. But the way this was implemented, starting in the Hoover administration, was to talk about how owning your own home and having it be a single-family home with a front yard and a fence makes you a better American. And I want to emphasize the idea that the message that comes from political leaders, the way people talk about the American dream, the association of a single-family home with a picket fence and a front yard, the association of that image with the American dream is a cultural construct that need not be the case. And Hoover started that. He did 2 things. There was a rhetorical campaign, basically a propaganda campaign, of talking about what it means to be a good citizen and home ownership and the relationship of those things. And this was while he was Secretary of Commerce, but all the way through then until when he was president. And he also initiated some government-sponsored market interventions, facilitating the design process for homes without facilitating the same design process for better multifamily homes, providing, paying for architects or home renovators to be able to develop plans that they could then market easily, but not paying for those same activities for dense urban housing situations. The next step under Roosevelt is what historians of this process call the two-tiered housing policy. It's little noticed that the biggest housing policy in the U.S. is when you talk about federal housing policy, people think of public housing or Section 8 vouchers or things like that. But actually, the top tier of federal housing policy, which started under the Roosevelt administration, was government support for suburban homeownership in a much more aggressive, much more interventionist way than Hoover had suggested. And the bottom tier, which receives much less funds, is a smaller part of federal outlays and federal tax policies, was for urban housing, and in particular, as you see here, both all into the same basket in a lot of ways as secondary, less favored, and disincentivized is public housing, multifamily housing, in mixed-use neighborhoods, and rental housing. It's a complicated story how this works, and I guess I'll oversimplify it by saying that mortgage market and the tax structures were set up to incentivize the top tier and to disincentivize the bottom tier. There was especially an intent to make sure that anything government was investing in city urban locations wouldn't be too good, because if it was, then those people wouldn't participate in the new booming suburban real estate market, which ended up, because of the way the mortgage market was constructed, predicated on continually increasing demand so prices would go up, which, by the way, worked until 2007. And look what happens when prices finally turned down. A house of cards collapsed. It was a house of cards that was constructed in the 1930s and the pre-World War II era. If anybody wants me to go into more detail on that, I can, but for sake of constructing the overall argument, I'm going to keep moving on. Transportation policy is the next piece, and here I want to make a few key points. First of all, we often talk about the interstate highway system and all the many, many miles that were built and the scale of the interstate highway system as a stimulant for decentralization and sprawl. And I'm not going to say that's wrong, but the point I want to make is that that was the end of a long process of decentralization, and it accelerated it and pushed it further, but it was not the beginning. We started funding highways in a different way than we funded mass transit as soon as the car was invented, essentially, within a few years. In the very first decade of the 20th century, there were states passing highway laws. By 1916, the federal government was passing highway laws, and these were highway laws that had an anti-density and anti-urban bias right from the very beginning. When the federal government first started funding highways, there was an exclusion. You could not spend that money. The states could not spend that money on urban roads or urban expressways. And later on, when urban expressways were added, it was capped at only 5% of the national expenditure could be spent within municipal limits. And later that increased to a maximum of 20%. This is at a time when something like 80% of the government's tax revenue was being collected in urban areas. So right from the start, there was a spatial transfer, collecting money where people live in cities and spending it to build infrastructure where nobody yet lives, or where very few people live. And that started 40 years at the federal level before the interstate highway legislation. And the interstate highway legislation just literally set it in concrete, but it had been going on for a long, long time. There were other urban, anti-urban dimensions to this that I want to talk about, not just that exclusion, but the way the money was distributed amongst the states. Empty states got more per capita than crowded states. So that again is a way in which this was a spatial transfer of resources at the time that this, over the course of the 20th century, was the single biggest investment in settlement patterns that the federal government made. the idea of mispriced roads and induced demand. Well, yesterday there was already the mention that induced demand is a jargony term that usually refers to the idea of when you build more highways, more people will use highways, and that was referred to as a feedback loop, which it is. But there's another part to this that is usually missed, which is that unlike notions of rail-based transit, mass transit, which is always the starting point is, will the revenues be sufficient to pay for the costs? And then we decide whether or not, if it won't meet it, is it worth considering subsidizing it, and to what extent will we subsidize it? Highway transportation has never followed that model. Right from the very beginning, the users were never expected to pay the costs of the investment in infrastructure. We have a fiction that, for example, with the interstate highway legislation, the imposition of things like a federal gas tax and other rubber tire fees, and there's state gas taxes, and you pay to register your car with the state, and you pay to get your driver's license, and those things need to be renewed, that those are all user fees that pay for the automotive infrastructure. But as a practical matter, all those user charges wrapped up together have never provided more than 40%, and if you look over the 20th century, the average is more like 25 to 30% of the costs of the infrastructure. So, the cost of that transportation system. So, if you back up for a minute and think about the induced demand idea, if you have something that is worth $1 and you're only charging people 35 cents for it, what's going to happen? They're going to line up, and they're going to line up, and they're going to line up, and they're going to want as much of it as they can. And that's why we have traffic problems. No matter how much we build for building highways or building transportation infrastructure, as long as we continue to underprice it, especially when we don't apply that same underpricing to other modes, there's always going to be excess demand, and that's what congestion is, excess demand for transportation facilities. Again, that's something that I could go into more detail, but I want to keep moving on to make the point here. The add-on that I want to add here, there's another fiction aside from the idea that our user fees, and by the way, tolls are included in that user fee 30-40% type number. The other fiction, aside from the fact that we paid for these highways in our gas taxes or other user fees, is the idea that there was a Cold War military defense element to building the interstates. There's good reason why a lot of people believe this. The legislation in 1956 was called the Interstate and Defense Highway Act. And a lot of the political rhetoric that was spoken at the time made these references. But the highway network, as built starting in the 1950s, had actually already been mapped before World War II, before the Cold War. The whole process was set in motion much earlier, including the bureaucratic structure, the payment mechanisms, the funding mechanisms, and the actual maps of where the routes would be. An interesting thing here, though, the person who was able to sell it to the nation as having real important defense implications was General Eisenhower when he was president. We associate the interstates with Eisenhower. Interestingly enough, 30 years earlier, before he was president, Eisenhower, right after World War I, was a young lieutenant coming back from World War I, and the military had ordered a whole bunch of new automotive machines, but the U.S. was in the war for World War I for such a short period of time that most of these machines arrived after the war was over. So what did the military do? They said, let's test out our new toys. And Eisenhower, as a young officer, was one of the people helping to run this transcontinental convoy, which turned out to be a disaster because most of these motorized vehicles built in 1916 and 17 didn't work very well. They broke down all the time. And the roads were in terrible, terrible shape, and they kept getting stuck. And there were some days where the convoy moved only 6 miles in an entire day because they kept getting stuck. They actually had to use horses to pull some of the cars out. It was just hilarious. This is the key thing. In Eisenhower's notes at the end of this, when he made a report, he said, and these are Eisenhower's own words, a national highway program could be justified on a military basis, but its true effect would be to, and this is his words, to colonize the unsettled portions of the country. So he knew for decades when he signed the interstate, legislation, that the real impact was not going to be a defense impact. That was political dressing. It might have some ability to evacuate some portion of cities, but any city big enough to be bombed, you can't get out of it in time anyway. Doesn't matter how many highways you build. He understood that the real implication was as an economic development tool. And he also understood that that economic development tool involved the auto industry and the oil industry and the tire industry and all the road gang that Dolores Hayden mentioned yesterday. Okay, so colonizing the interior was actually, and unsettled portions was a part of the intent. Okay. Let me say a little bit here about the intentional and very successful efforts to influence cultural preferences. I already mentioned the home ownership ideal and the way that was, the spin on it and the way it was pushed, starting in the Hoover administration, first rhetorically, then in the Roosevelt administration with funding behind the housing. But the transportation piece also worked that way. I want to give the example here of the 1939 World's Fair, realizing that there are values other than price. I did mention price already, but there are values other than price. And the 1939 World's Fair, some of you may be familiar with it, but for me, this is actually a turning point in the American so-called love affair with the car and the sprawl that we ended up with in the post-war era. Keep going in the wrong direction. So first of all, context for the 1939 World's Fair. Let's realize that the initial idea here is that the present day in the 1930s was very, very grim. The Depression and the rise of Nazi Germany and clearly cities as they were built after the industrial era were not functioning well. So the theme of the fair was building a world of tomorrow, which was really cities of tomorrow. It was based on the hope that if we ever get out of the Depression and this terrible situation going on in Europe, we should use our brain power, our design, our technology, our design strengths, our new technologies to build a better future, and we can. The thing about the fair is that 45 million visitors went to it, and this was at a time when there was no national media other than newspapers. So the influences on American culture were not as pervasive and homogeneous as they are now with television, radio, the internet, etc. This was one of those ways in which a vision of a great future was shared with many, many Americans. The population of the U.S. at the time was not that much more than 100 million, and 45 million visitors went to this fair. There were three key exhibits, Democracy, Futurama, and the film The City. Very briefly, Democracy was in this sphere here that you see. The symbol of the fair was the Trilon and the Perisphere, and inside the sphere, which you got into by riding around the circle of the sphere there, you can see the Heliocline, the world's longest escalator, which you rode to get inside this exhibit. And all it was a scale model of the perfect city of the future, which was for 1.5 million people occupying 11,000 square miles. Roughly, let's say that's 1.5 million people in a state the size of New Jersey. That's an enormous amount of sprawl. That's what Democracy was. Futurama, I will say this, for a great deal of wonderful detail and the way this exhibit was constructed and the embedded cultural values and the way it affected people's understanding of the car. For more detail, I will refer you to a forthcoming article by Dolores Hayden that's coming out in the Journal of Urban History. What I'll say about it now for our purposes is that this was funded by General Motors and was a Disney-esque. In fact, Walt Disney was inspired by it. And Epcot was really based in a lot of ways on Walt Disney's experience at the 1939 World's Fair. He realized that people would pay money to ride around in little cars and be entertained, rail-based cars, ironically. And Futurama was an General Motors view of what this great future could look like if we would only embrace the right policies and the right technology. They sold 50 years worth of cars at the 1939 World's Fair without displaying cars. They were displaying a lifestyle based on the car. Okay, so what's the point of explaining all this from so many decades ago? This was the smart growth with a statement, making a statement of the period. It was designed to accomplish political objectives. I already mentioned anti-communism. It also, at the time that there were revolutions in various European countries between the wars and political unrest, if you could get everybody spread out, they were less likely to foment revolution or upheaval. So it had political objectives, it had social objectives. Cities were overcrowded. There were terrible social and medical conditions in overcrowded neighborhoods and cities. So getting people spread out served political and social goals. The home ownership piece served those goals. Economically, it stimulated the automotive industry in a way that was the prime engine of American economic growth all the way through the 1960s and early 70s until the first energy shock. So this was smart growth politically, socially, economically, and in terms of public health at the time. Get everybody spread out. Now we have this was smart growth question mark. These goals have been achieved, the original goals have been achieved, but we now have embedded these unneeded incentives that are structurally built into so many of our government policies and the way people have constructed household budgets and corporate location decisions and all those things. But we've overcorrected and we are still doing it. Those policies still remain in effect. So it was smart growth, but it produced all kinds of problems that we now recognize, and it's why we're having a conference like this, is figuring out how to have smarter growth, even though what we have is what used to be called smart growth. My point there is, it all depends on what your values are. And our values have shifted, so therefore our policies need to shift. Defending the status quo is defending a status quo that's based on the imperatives of the 1930s, and this is not the 1930s anymore. So, our values have changed. We've added new categories to sustainability, in addition to the political, social, economic, and medical that I already mentioned. We have environmental, and really in most people's minds, the environmental sustainability is the first dimension they think of when they think of sustainability. And I think in many ways, quite rightly, that's one of the drivers. We no longer have the same political, social, economic, and medical problems that we had then, and we have a new priority in our sustainability model. So we need to go back and change housing policy and transportation policy and start talking culturally about different kinds of choices and different preferences in order to create different outcomes. It's not enough just to document that we have a problem. If we understand how we have it, how we got there, we can get someplace different by changing those causal factors. Just a quick note of some of our new political, social, and economic and medical problems associated with overcorrecting. I want to mention the atomization of community that we have from homogenized, self-selected, narrow worlds as people moved to subdivisions where there are limited number of price points, less diversity along so many lines, but also one of the issues, and it came up yesterday with school districts and schooling. I think it was a question at Tony Flynn's talk last night, and I would argue that in the decentralized, more suburbanized, more sprawling world, many Americans don't understand that their community is bigger than their school district. And there's a disjuncture between social and economic community boundaries, which are metropolitan, regional, national, and the perceived boundaries where people think that their neighborhood extends as far as either their street or their school district. The result of that in terms of political and social settings is that anybody that couldn't participate in that top tier of the housing policy, or people that were left behind for a variety of economic and racial, the two biggest reasons, are left behind left out of people's notions of the community that they're responsible to, and it's affected our national politics in that way, I would argue. Certainly, the energy needs of this auto-centered lifestyle that we live, I think, is something we're well aware of, but not just in terms of climate change and sustainability of energy policy, but also that it's affected foreign policy in very expensive ways, measured in both time, lives, and money. Medically, the national problem that we have with obesity, that Americans don't exercise because they are never out of their car. Economically, We only need to look at what's happened to the economy in the last few years to recognize that this smart growth policy built on ever-increasing home ownership and generating increasing upward pressure on prices, our over-enthusiasm in this direction really came to the verge of destroying the global economy. So circumstances have changed, our goals have altered, but the underlying incentives still remain the same. So simply put, we need to make changes. What kinds of changes? Well, I would say, first of all, we need to just level the playing field, balance the scales. When cities were overcrowded and we had all these other issues, we were trying to tilt the scales so that people would be more likely to buy a car, be more likely to buy a single-family home built on the edge. There were all kinds of reasons for that we had for tilting the scales, government policy to tilt the scales, for all those reasons I just mentioned. Well, the reasons don't apply anymore, so why don't we level the playing field and balance the scales? I'm not even saying that we have to tilt it the other way, but why do we need to keep it tilted out when we're recognizing that that's a policy problem and the original policy imperatives don't apply anymore? We need to stop pushing by force of national subsidy Americans to choose lower density, auto-dependent, unwalkable communities built on separated uses. There's a political backlash to that. There was the mention of the Obama administration's Livable Community Initiative, and immediately you get people saying, well, I get to decide what's livable for me. The federal government's going to tell me what a livable community is, or the federal government's going to tell me what kind of car to drive. If I want to drive an SUV and that's my preference, why don't you let me? You can imagine I've written a couple of op-ed pieces along these lines in the New York Times, and the kind of hate mail that I get from people accusing me of being un-American. And if I could answer those people, I don't, of course, you never engage directly in the hate mail that you get, but if I could answer those kinds of responses, I would say, I get that. And this is where we get to the really incredible artful political messaging that Hoover did, or General Motors did, or the people that designed Democracy did. We need to control the terms of the discourse and create the argument in a way that doesn't come off as un-American, and I think that's easy. We're not talking about limiting, or I'm not suggesting that we limit individual choices. Instead, I'm actually saying we should provide equal support for a wider range of choices. Right now, Americans have limited choices about how to lead their lives because this is a singularly focused set of policies. And if we even the playing field and diversify the approach to these policy areas in housing and transportation, people will have more choices and government will be intervening less in that choice. Choices between transportation modes with equal government support for all modes. Not we assume that we're going to subsidize roads and highways, and we assume that we will not subsidize mass transit. That's just exactly the opposite approach to investment, subsidy, expenditure, whatever. Choices between modes, choices between different kinds of residential settings, again with equal support for the variety so that we avoid the monoculture that current policy points us towards. Americans shouldn't have to forego government support if they want to live in a manner that is more sustainable, not just environmentally, but politically, socially, or economically. Right now, you have to opt out of all these hidden and unhidden handouts if you want to do what I would consider to be the right thing. We can make enormous progress just by evening the scales. Okay, very briefly, because I have only 5 minutes here, I want to talk about some of the problems with the smart growth movement. First of all, you can tell from the way I've constructed this argument, despite the fact that people meet in small rooms, in small communities to talk about better growth patterns, this entire problem that I've just laid out was not caused by local decisions and cannot be stopped by local decisions. It is experienced locally, but it is a national and global problem, not a slope problem that was created locally. So I just want to say that smart growth, I do not believe, can be achieved solely by fighting the battle on the ground locally. It's created by these national policies and must be addressed by changes in national policy. Local policies, local efforts can have an impact, but the overall change in the pattern will require an overall change in policy. Too often what ends up happening is you get inequitable outcomes. When one community tries to change things where they are, it pushes the problem to other places. And it doesn't change the overall extent to which there's a problem. You can look at that on a small scale and say, when one town starts with smart growth policies, they talk about the parking, the people that are going to insist on having parking or building parking when they build development are going to move to places that don't have those restrictions. And you're concentrating the people who see the light, which makes it less likely that you're going to achieve political change anywhere else. People that want Portland are going to move to Portland instead of trying to turn their city into something more like Portland. So the local efforts produce local successes and don't really change the overall national problem. So let's talk about the big four strategies here, and I'm only going to pick one of them to go into detail. This is common practices for people that want to stimulate smart growth in their locality. Open space preservation, growth management, central downtown development, and the new emphasis on other modes of transportation. Let's just dig in right to open space, because this is one of the steps most commonly taken. First of all, this is not a new idea. Massachusetts 50 years ago, in the 1960s, initiated a program of paying for 50% of open space preservation land purchases. So this is not a new idea, and we still have a significant problem, so that's an example. But really, again, because I'm running out of time, I want to say that a lot of these first two, open space preservation and growth management, end up being more used for NIMBY purposes than they are in producing smart growth. More often than not, that's people trying to protect their community from change instead of trying to change their community. And it, as I said, produces inaccessibility because of cost, because you've limited the additional units being built in particular towns, which produces gentrification and perpetuates exclusivity. Banana, what's Banana doing up there? Well, we're all familiar with NIMBY, but one of the things that happens with some of these measures is it produces Banana, which is also, like Tony Flint last night was saying, enough already with the Jane Jacobs, and that headline was, enough already for allowing everybody to block anything from happening if they don't like it. And Banana stands for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. Okay, so this kind of anti-sprawl activism that we've had has been misplaced, I think. Misplaced because of the strategies adopted, and misplaced because it's been focused on local implementation of a problem that is not created locally. And the result is growth that actually isn't smart. To have smart growth, we must overcome the fiction that our community is only, I'm restating things, but I really want to emphasize it. The fiction that our community is only as big as our street, our neighborhood, or our school district. We must act like a national community that is part of a global community and address it on that scale. And we need to change the underlying causes. We have done this before for good reasons at the time. When we did this in the interwar period, we were solving the problems at the time, and we created smart growth to solve those problems. We just let it go on for too long and we never reassessed it. So now we need to, again, address it in that way. Circumstances have changed, so the policies must change.